Hi, welcome back to Memory Protection. It's an Apple News podcast set 20 years ago. Today, we're looking back to March 2001. I'm Josh McGrath, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Matt Smith.
Hey, Josh.
Hey, Matt.
Changed my clocks, but seems like they're a month out of date.
A month? A whole month?
Yeah, something's weird.
Huh. That's foreboding.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we can troubleshoot at the end of the show.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll save it. Okay. All right. Sorry, everybody. We'll move on.
Follow up. Nothing.
Nothing. You get nothing.
You get nothing. All right. Do you want to intro Hot Cocoa?
I do, but before we get into Hot Cocoa, did you notice the header on one of the articles you used for research this month?
I wasn't paying that much attention. What did I miss?
All right, I want you to click on the 9 Mac OS X apps to get you started.
Oh, okay.
Load that up.
Addicted to fonts? What are you seeing? Wait, Hot Cocoa. Fuck, Hot Cocoa. How long has this been a thing? I haven't seen this before.
So for the listener, we're using this article for the main topic this week. 9 Mac OS X apps to get you started, and it's under the header Hot Cocoa, your weekly taste of OS X for the Mac Observer.
We've been cribbing their style,
and apparently we've been totally like plagiarizing the Mac Observer, which is ironic because our Hot Cocoa segment is mostly Mac Observer articles.
It's fair. Well, time to rethink the podcast, Josh.
I think it's time to rethink the podcast.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, this threw me for quite a loop. That's funny you didn't notice.
What are we going to call the segment now?
I guess we got to fall back to the Redmond Minute.
Okay. Done and done.
That's an answer.
The Cupertino Corner.
No, seriously, though, we do have to rename it.
Yeah. Go back and retroactively change it.
Next on the Redmond Minute.
Cupertino Corner. Anyway, segment formerly known as Hot Cocoa. Apple to dub the first OS X release as macOS 10.0.
10.10.
I'm not sure why this is news.
Because it's awkward. I think it's something that we don't really think about anymore. But, it is technically macOS 10, 10 point whatever.
Right. macOS being macOS 10 being the signifier that differentiates it from classic macOS. Now it's back to macOS.
And they actually have a quote from Phil Schiller explaining the naming convention. He says, we used the Roman numeral because we thought it would be cool and fun.
Those are two adjectives I always associate with Phil Schiller.
And Roman numerals, to be fair. But officially, it's Mac OS X 10.0 with an X, just to be clear.
Yeah, Apple suggests that it will ship on time.
It did.
Despite it shipping on time.
It was bad.
Yeah. Spoiler alert for the rest of the episode. Mac OS X 10.0 is not a great release.
In this article, we see the introduction of a phrase that I think of as the phrase of the month, and that's Primetime. Because even leading up to the release, people seem to think OS X might not be ready for prime time.
And again, leading up to the release on the 21st of March, Apple confirms that iTunes and iMovie 2 would be released for macOS X that weekend. So alongside the release, you would get iTunes and iMovie. So that's kind of nice because, surprise, you're going to be running a lot of classic apps in OS X if you bought it on day one.
Yarp.
NARP. All right. So if you weren't sure what we're talking about, March 2001, March 24th, 2001 is the release date of Mac OS X, the long-awaited sequel to Mac OS 9. 7,
Don't
6,
call it a
5,
comeback.
4, 3, 2, and 1.
Yeah.
And this
Followed by macOS 11.
20 years later.
20 years later.
And this is, this is kind of a big deal for Apple, right? I mean,
Yeah, let's start with the positives. They shipped it.
it looks nice.
It looks great.
It technically runs on older G3s.
It's the most stable version of macOS. John Siracusa says so.
It looks nice.
Aqua.
Lickable. It's got memory protection.
Yes, folks, the time has come. The train is leaving the station. The train has left the station.
And arrived at the destination.
That's right. Toot toot.
So yeah, I mean, I think we're going to talk about OS X. We're going to talk about it sort of in terms of, well, John Siracusa's exhaustive review and then Macworld's review-ish thing.
Review style article.
Macworld didn't commit to giving it a rating of 1 to 5 mice.
Oh, is that what you were looking for?
That's what I was looking for, and I didn't find it. And even the article that I have that sort of outlines OS X, they don't rate it, and they just sort of say if you want to do this, good luck. Here's some pros and cons.
I think I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I think they do come down pretty strong on one side.
I think yes, they have a recommendation, but they also sort of hedge with these user personas they define.
And I think to be fair, Siracusa hedges a little bit too, and even in his way. And we're sort of dancing around this, but like it's not hard to come to a conclusion about 10.0, and it's not, folks, it's not ready for prime time.
It is well received, but it is not recommended.
Yeah, that's the funny thing is for the longest time I heard about like the history of OS X and how it was pretty rocky in the beginning and how there was a lot of issues with performance, and at least based on professional reviewer feedback and criticism, at its release, the feeling in the room is one of not like disappointment, but like it's almost hopeful. Like this is not good enough, but you can see where this is going.
Right. And I think both John's article and the OS X article, I think being immersed in sort of the technology world at the time, I think the sort of big innovation they know is going to help OS X is dedicated graphics cards in the Mac. And more powerful dedicated graphics cards, because graphics cards around the late 90s, early 2000s were just beginning to become a thing.
Right. Well, okay. That brings us to like, what are the problems?
Sure.
And performance, I would say, is the main one. And you can get more specific about that. But in general, using OS X with its new Aqua interface and transparent or translucent windows and opaque elements and whatnot are it does not run very well depending on your setup. And even then, even if you have a strong computer, it's not necessarily a good experience.
Right. Yeah. And I think, there's some reasons for that. And I think graphics cards not being powerful enough or just not being existent or to the degree they need to be for OS X. And I think even having OS X be optimized for that, like I think that's all sort of still up in the air a little bit.
I would say GPUs and CPUs, because like there's a pretty stark difference you get in benchmarks people have between G3s and G4s. Mm-hmm. Like OS X is very obviously optimized for the AltiVec instruction set.
Sure.
And the G4s have a huge advantage for use for quality of life.
Right.
And the G3s are kind of sad. Actually makes me a little bit worried about we're thinking of installing it on our iBooks.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Look, it's going to be, I never ran 10.0 on my iBook.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was like, when we got them, they had OS X on them. I was like, it ran fine. It was great. And I was thinking, oh wait, it was like 10.1 or 10.2, right?
Yeah.
Or was it Tiger?
I think one of them was Tiger. That might have been mine. I don't remember, but
I was like, and that made me feel like, oh, they do fix it eventually.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and even in like, I remember, So I guess sort of one thing we've been talking about is installing OS X on our iBooks, which we didn't do for this episode because we wanted to talk about just the reviews a little bit more. I never experienced 10.0. I listened to the reviews because I was not that big of an enthusiast yet. I had just gotten my G4 in the winter of last year, and I didn't want to sort of like screw it up with OS 10.
Even though you got Ultivec.
Yeah. I mean, part of it was I didn't know what I was missing out on, and I think I'm glad I waited. But even 10.1 was a little bit of a 10.1 was a little rough.
From Macworld to Matt's ears. If you earn your keep churning out graphics and designs, whether for print, video, or the web, there's no good reason to move to OS 10 yet.
Yeah. Macworld sort of outlines the two most important applications in desktop publishing being Quark Express and Adobe Photoshop. Photoshop, not ready for OS 10 at launch. Quark Express, it takes them a few years to get there.
Well, when Apple does a platform shift, it usually takes Adobe a few minutes to catch up. We're even experiencing that today.
Oh, that's right. With the iPad,
the M1 with the M1 Max. No, not even that. Even just M1 Max. Like isn't a Photoshop like just coming out now?
I think so. Yeah.
Of course, there's a big difference between the Apple Silicon transition and this transition to OS 10, and it's that and I think Syracuse talks about this is that the emulated experience, the classic environment. It's classic in an OS 10, but for here I'm talking about Intel compiled apps. Like there's a big difference, right, in terms of performance. Mm-hmm. Like today, you hear lots of people talking about like not really even thinking about the Intel apps because there's not very much performance dip. Right. We've just been using Photoshop, It's like It's been fine. But turn the clock back and there is a big difference in performance. If you're running the classic environment versus running stock 9.1 just, on your G4 or whatever.
I think even just sort of the experiential difference too, I think would play into that. Having a OS 9 layer sitting on top of your OS 10, like not being, I think that was sort of my issue early on with OS 10. Like while it was great to sort of like be in OS 10 and be able to use all of the apps I needed, like it was several years before everybody was sort of fully into that world where all your apps were updated and you were just running in OS 10. And it was a little bit of a strange experience.
Oh, I assume because it's like a different window Chrome, right?
Oh, yeah. Like you're running Platinum Windows alongside OS 10 Windows. And I mean, the beauty of the thing is that everything worked for the most part.
Which is, to be fair, it's really cool. Like, in the same way that it's like extremely cool today with Rosetta 2. Rosetta 1 is equally impressive. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't quite as much of a slam dunk.
Sure. Yeah, I think especially because that transition, like, and I think to Syracuse's point, like, I can't move around the operating system in the same way that I could in OS 9. And it is the speed at which the operating system works that is hamstringing that. The slowness. Yeah,
and I'd say the Macworld article is a great overview of the problems with OS 10. Mm-hmm. It talks about gives you a good overview of what applications are going to be available. Spoiler alert, not many. Same with drivers, a lot of issues there. They go over who is macOS 4, basically just for geeks. Mm-hmm. It's a good overview, but Syracuse's review, not surprisingly, is much more in depth and focuses a lot more on the experience and the UI. And the experience of being a long time Mac OS user, mm-hmm. and how they might feel using OS 10. And a lot of this is review or sort of a redux of his earlier articles. So when we talked about the beta review, we went into his issues with the spatial finder or the lack thereof, and the dock and various quibbles he had with that. And a lot of that resurfaces here with a few surprises here and there with new things.
Yeah. I think one thing I want to talk about is that sort of spatial finder. And I know we've talked about it in the past. I know we sort of I have sort of looked upon it fondly, but I'm thinking about it again, and I don't know how you feel. But having not lived with the spatial finder for 20 years and gotten used to these new OS paradigms, the dock, things, a lot of things that John complains about and has complained about over the years. I don't know. Like I find myself like not having these problems. And I don't know if that is sort of like a generational divide where like most of my Mac time has been spent in OS 10 and knowing how it works and what the expectation is. And then either finding that acceptable or learning to sort of like live with the problems, right? Because like the concept of the spatial finder is a nice one, but it's not really how I use my computer at all. Thinking about John, who's coming to OS 10 from a classic Mac user who kind of came up in the 80s and the 90s when the Mac was really sort of pioneering these graphical user interfaces and sort of like banking its interface paradigm on knowing where everything was in the Finder. Moving away from that certainly could be pretty affecting. So I don't necessarily know that I'm arguing for one or the other, but I'm because I'm looking at this review in retrospect and thinking about my own behavior in relationship to how I use OS 10. And this is one instance where I'm not necessarily seeing the problem. I have the memory of the spatial finder, but I don't miss it.
Yes, I think I know what you're talking about, because I think I was feeling similar emotions as I was reading his review, where if you've ever read Syracuse' stuff or heard him speak, he's an expert at forming a coherent argument for something, right? And you read his arguments for the spatial finder, which, just to reiterate what Matt said, like it's just about like, imbuing things with with physicality, to say like this belongs here in this XY coordinate,
right.
It's always there where you put it. Like I'm explaining it very badly, but like it's about making sure that like the user controls where things are, and it's about like using like muscle memory, right?
Yeah, and expecting that those things are going to be there when you open that folder up after you've closed it from where it sits in the Finder, it opens back up to that spot. So you can sort of anticipate the interface working the way that you've set it up, like your desktop. Like you put a piece of paper over here, that's where it's going to stay until you move it again, right? I think that's sort of the analog.
So Mac OS 9, like you open a folder, it opens a new window, and then you can place that somewhere in space. Whereas what we're talking about in OS 10 is the browser style, where the internal state of the window changes as you move through the file structure.
Right.
I'm sure that if he was here, he would throttle us, but that's the best we could do. Sorry, John. But I was thinking, like, I read his arguments for this stuff, and I'll extend this to arguments about the dock and how the dock should work, or how he thinks it should work.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, no, that's a good argument. He's right. Like, this seems like it would be better. And then I've been using it like that for 15 years. And it's like, it's second nature to me. And it's like, he's right that it would be better, but also it made me think, like, if I could ask John about something about this review, I would want to talk to him about this idea. He even touches on it when he talks about Windows in the article, about like how Windows has at this point in time has pretty much settled on the browser style navigator, right?
Right.
And how it seems to, I think his phrase is something like it's like good enough for most people, and so people seem to be making do with it.
Right.
And as history shows us, like, yeah, like they make do with it, and also Mac OS people make do for it for the next 20 years. Obviously, like, this alternative of the browser it's not so bad that it's untenable, but that doesn't mean that there's not a better option. True. What I would want to ask him about is what does that feel like to sort of think about these ideas in computing that are superior, but now so much like time and like almost like scar tissue is formed around these other possibly inferior solutions, that those better ideas are probably never going to be implemented, right?
Yeah, and I think there's also something to be said about the literacy of the consumers or the users of these computers, right? In 1983, when the graphical user interface was sort of first becoming a thing that people were interested in, having a one-to-one analog for how your desktop works, even calling it the desktop,
right,
and making sure that the documents you placed or the windows you placed on the desktop stayed where you put them, so you would remember where they were. Like, those metaphors were really solid for a body of new computer users that had no context for how these things were supposed to work.
Solid, but still, I'd say still in flux, right? Because there's still an era where you have people like at Windows being like, I don't know, maybe it should be like a literal like skeuomorphic desk, you know?
Well, sure. I guess I'm speaking specifically on the Mac side, right? Like the people that designed the GUI for the Mac, and I think that adopted those ideas from Xerox. Like the idea was a literal desktop. Like put your documents where you want them on your, like organize your desktop in virtual world as you would in the real life.
Right. A mental model to help understand like a completely like abstract system.
Exactly. Right. So then move on 20 years later and we're talking about Mac OS 10 and the question I think I would ask is, do we need those models anymore?
Well, it's something I think about a lot, especially thinking about various demographics of like age ranges of people. Because I can still go and talk to an older person, someone like a baby boomer, and like I'll be like taking them through some computing task, and I'll a lot of computer people experience like, well, they'll stop you and they'll ask like, what did you say? What do you mean the window or the file or the folder or whatever? Sure. Or something more obscure. And you stop and you say like, and you have to think like, oh, right, this is not, you have to have empathy in that moment and say like, oh, this is not obvious to someone who's not just living in it every day.
Yeah.
And then you go to the other end of the spectrum with like kids these days. Kids these days with their iPods and their iPads and saying like, well, like I grew up in a half and half era where, for a certain point in my life, there weren't really computers accessible to me. And I had to learn how to use them in school. Right.
Right.
And the people teaching me also had to learn how to use them.
Yeah.
And maybe there were some experts, but the whole environment was not people who were experts. Whereas now you're 20 years later and, I'm so inured and it's not that everyone is experts, but like there's just this osmosis, I think, that happens for some of this stuff.
Right.
At least for people of a certain age. And I often wonder about kids who grow up using iPads. What does their computer literacy look like? Do they just have a sort of more innate sense for things, for the metaphors? Because obviously no one's born understanding like, what a disclosure icon means. But if you grew up using like direct manipulation and tapping, you can be experimental, especially on, Apple's platforms where it's harder to completely screw things up, right?
Sure.
That's sort of one of the basic ideals. And so, yeah, to go back to your question of like, do we need these metaphors anymore? I don't have a good answer one way or the other, but I do see how the metaphors begin to be diluted over time. And so, there's that old chestnut about why is a floppy disk the save icon?
Sure.
Right. We're so far removed. Like you and I are far removed from that, even though we actually use floppy disks.
Right.
But we haven't used floppy disks in
20 years.
20 years, right? I think that's about when I got my first thumb drive, right?
Right.
And especially like children today are not going to know what a floppy. That's why I say it's a joke, right? But it also, I think it's exemplary of this problem of, it's not that kids haven't ever seen a desktop,
yeah,
or a file cabinet. Maybe they haven't. I don't know.
But I mean, I think even that metaphor today is much more abstracted from what it used to be, right? Like your desktop today is more sort of like it's a wasteland for crap you don't want to deal with, and it's like a picture frame, right? Like it's not like there's no sort of like, I mean, I guess unless your desktop is a wasteland, but
no, to that point, like I put nothing on my desktop, like literally nothing.
Yeah, and I think that's the way Apple wants you to live, right? They want this to be this sort of like pristine area where it's just a moment of serenity, right? It's not a workspace anymore. It's a
springboard.
Yeah, it's like a no-fly zone. But I think thinking about sort of like shifting these interface paradigms, like let's take the desktop metaphor away, and Apple has worked hard over the last 15 years to sort of remove the idea of finding your way through windows and navigation, a thing of the past. And I think I'm going to beat this drum again. I think that important innovation of the browser window, like that sort of like 3-4 pane, back and forth navigation structure that they introduced in OS 10, I think still might be the most important part of OS 10.
I mean, Syracuse is quick to say, like, it's the reason it's important to talk about the Finder is because, well, the Finder is the computer for most people.
Right.
Obviously applications are important, and no one's saying they're not. But what is a computer?
Help computer.
Like, what's a computer?
Hey kid, I'm a computer.
Body massage.
What's a body massage?
Like, is it just a file system?
Yeah.
Ding, ding. Is it like, and if it is a file system and the collaboration of files and the organization of said files, like, then how you view them, how you organize them, how you put them in places is the prime computing task for an end user, right? Mm-hmm. Putting aside like word processing or Google Maps or whatever.
Yep.
Browsing the web, especially coming out of the 90s into the early aughts, like before the digital hub is really well rooted, where like the main thing you might do on your computer is watch DVDs, listen to music, and browse the web. Like, yeah. That's just starting to be the thing that people are using their computers for, right? Mm-hmm. When I say people, I mean like general populace.
Yeah,
it's one of like the beautiful things about these computers. Thinking about them back then is just like the simplicity of what you would actually do with them, like manage files, process words. Maybe, I don't know.
Rip some CDs.
Maybe, if you're really feeling wild.
If you got the power to burn.
And of course you can do a lot. You can Quark, you can shop, you can what's the database program?
Microsoft Access?
No, the one, the Apple one, the Claris one.
FileMaker?
You can make files.
In a professional way.
Yeah. On your professional Macintosh. So it's like we're struggling to talk about this because it is a very abstract thing, right? To say like when you ask like, is the desktop metaphor still useful? Yeah, and it's like I don't know. It's like asking a goldfish, is water useful, right?
Well, I think Apple's asking the question here, right? Like Apple knows what it's doing.
Well, but we see them having the conversation with themselves with iOS and iPadOS, where they're like, we're going to redo it. Oh wait, maybe that was a mistake. Well, maybe we'll bring some of the stuff back in. Yeah,
but I think that sort of like, and I think going back again, that browser window, hierarchical, it's navigate into and out of views. And in OS 10, those views are folders. In iOS, those views are interface screens. In iPadOS, it can be a mix of both, right? That's the innovation they put forward. They said like, okay, remember the spatial finder? That might not be as important as you thought it once was, right? Here's this new idea. If you need to get into and out of something, we're going to give you the pathway, and you can see the pathway you took, right? And we're going to extend that metaphor to a tiny device and then a slightly larger device a couple of years later. And guess what? It's all going to work out, right? Like when I'm looking at an iOS application, I'm not worried about where I am in the application. Apple has engineered iOS that I can get back to where I need to be generally within a click or two. And good application developers understand that. And they understand the hierarchy level, getting in and out and not to let you get too deep. Mm-hmm. And I think if you use the browser in OS 10, I think you also understand that. Hey, I don't want to navigate like 6 levels deep, right? But I think that is prep work for what Apple does 7 years from now or 6 years from now. Like, and yes, we're just talking about files, but I think they understand because, well, not even 7 years from now, they do it in the iPod, right? They use this same file browser in the iPod.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Yeah.
Like, I mean, like this is your new spatial metaphor. And is it as visually effective as a representation of everything in its place over time? No, it's not. But if you understand, or if you think about how they sort of transform this metaphor into easily browsing songs on a device that has a scroll wheel and a 1.5-inch screen, I think you quickly start to see the benefits. And they may not be obvious on the desktop, but they become essential on these tiny little devices.
Well, that's funny you put it like that, because that's an argument we have all the time these days of saying like, well, yes, this paradigm works well on mobile because of the space constraints, right? Like the navigation style makes a lot of sense on iOS, right?
Yeah.
But does it make so much sense to bring that back to the Mac and say like, Mac apps are gonna work like this too?
Yeah, but I mean, the Finder already did work like that. The Finder has worked like that for 20 years, and obviously we're not talking about bespoke interfaces and shifting between them. We're talking about diving into and out of a folder structure, and that being the metaphor. And I think some of that works. Doing some of that on the Mac works, but I think, as we've seen, just taking iOS and iPadOS apps whole cloth and jamming them back to the Mac isn't quite the slam dunk Apple thought it might be.
They added a proxy icon to the title bar, though.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah, they did a better job with 10.0 than Big Sur. I'm so mad. I know the proxy icon is still there, but you have to like hover to get it.
What is the proxy icon?
That's the little
the folder.
That's like the little icon that says this is the file you're looking at, right? At the top of a Mac OS title bar, right?
Yeah, that needs to be fixed in the next.
That needs to be better, because I use it a lot. Because I don't know if people know this, but you can click on that little icon and drag it around, and it's an object in the system. You can use it to change the place that the file lives. You can command click on it to see where it lives in the file system. It's great. It's really useful. They shouldn't hide it. I don't know why they're hiding it. They should learn from the past.
Well, I mean, that's always the way of these releases, is that they'll 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
To quote the great John Siracusa, throughout its development, it seems the philosophy of the OS X UI has been to strip everything back to its barest essentials. Barest essentials. And then build it back up in response to user feedback. An optimist might see this as a refreshing break with the past, while a pessimist might see it as an inability to learn from the mistakes and successes of the past. Oh, John, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about the next 20 years.
I mean, he's still using it, so he still sees something in it.
Oh, he is. I was just laughing at this quote, because it's like, with the benefit of hindsight, as we like to say on this show, that's Mac OS X.
Yeah, and I think
it's going to keep happening.
I think it's sort of hard to see the forest through the trees too, right? Like OS X doesn't start getting good until 10.2. 10.1, they made it faster. It's much faster, but it's still pretty sluggish. 10.2, it became usable for sort of day-to-day stuff. And it just kept getting better after. Like that's when OS X really became, I think, OS X is 10.2. And it kept getting better after that. So these first few years are pretty rough. Like it's not all bad, but it does take a lot to get used to. And I think while these reviews sort of, they can see the forest through the trees, I don't think they can see what's on the other side. They can't see the field on the other side of the forest yet. Like they know it's going to get better. Like they know GPUs and faster CPUs and further optimization are going to make OS X better. But what like the sort of like lickability and the sheen and the polish that this operating system has that really starts to shine as the computers get better and get faster and more responsive, that none of that becomes apparent for a few years. And then you start to see like, oh, wow, this really is a lot different. Like moving around this system and using this operating system feels distinctly different than classic Mac OS, right?
Well, and at that point you have so much more like buy-in from software developers.
Right, exactly. And then, and the development community understands what it takes to make an OS X application versus an OS 9 application, and then people start to sort of understand the UI concepts and start playing with them and doing interesting things. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's obvious that 10.0 it's not a misstep. It is what Apple had to do to keep rolling the ball, right? Like keep moving.
I'll say this. I was heartened by the optimism in these, mostly negative reviews.
Right.
Like you said, they pointed out its flaws, but they could see that it had a lot of potential. while pretty like across the board, people were like, don't install this unless you have to. Mm-hmm. There wasn't anyone saying we should give Mac, like the next Mac operating system, another crack, right?
Right.
No one's saying like, this ain't it. No one's saying like, oh, we need to start over. It's just that like, this is pretty rough. It needs more polish. There's a lot of work to do, but this is where it's going. This is the future. I think Macworld literally says this is the future.
Right. And I think even in the beta, you could sort of feel that. Like, it's like booting in OS 9 versus booting in OS 10. Like, you can feel how different OS 10 is. And I think thinking about Windows 98 or ME or whatever the hell they got going at the time, like, you can feel how distinct and different it is from that. Like, it is to use OS 10 is like it felt like using the future, right? And I think Apple's making future computers. They look like nothing else. Apple's making an operating system that will eventually look and feel like nothing else. Apple starts making devices that look and work differently than other people's devices, right? And I think that's what people sort of like, you can feel that part of it. These initial reviews are, on the whole, pretty critical, but I nowhere in these reviews do I get the sense that they misunderstood the effort and thoughtfulness it took to come up with this 10.0 release.
Right. I also wonder, like, with the timing of the release being so close to WWDC, if people weren't willing to cut it a little slack to say, like, yeah, this is pretty rough, but also WWDC is basically next week, and I'm sure they'll have new stuff for us.
Right.
I'm sure they'll explain, what's coming next.
Right.
Well, that's going to do it for March 2001. If you'd like to reach out to us, of course, you can always come and hang out on Twitter. Send us a message using the handle @MemProShow. Or you can send us an email if you wanted to.
We don't get many.
You don't get many. Or you can send an email to the address memoryprotectionshow@gmail.com. Boot up OmniWeb and go to memoryprotection.show if you'd like to see the show notes and see all the cool art Matt picks out for every episode. I feel like people don't get to see that, right? Anyway, this is the outro.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I'm going to make a John Syracuse style complaint about this article. It's not about the article. It's about Ars Technica. It's that I did a lot of the reading of this article on my phone, and every time I would go to a new page,
oh God,
the
ads popping in.
The ads would take over the audio and pause my music.
Oh geez, I had ads popping, like lazy loading in and jumping the content halfway down the page. So every time I read, I had to reposition my browser.
Oh my God, that sucks.
I hate the web.
The web was a mistake.
Yeah.
I think is the conclusion. Sometimes though, I do actually feel like that.
Yeah, I mean, if all it was going to be is a data mining tool for your most sensitive of data, then I think, yeah, it was a mistake.
Well, actually, this is like a total tangent, but I was speaking to John Syracuse. There's a great episode of the talk show with him, John Gruber. He actually touches on his macOS reviews.
Yeah.
You should go listen to it. But they start talking about web apps versus native apps. And,
it was a good episode.
It's really good. But they touched on this thing I think about all the time. I think about it in the context of games a lot. But this issue of like non-standard UIs that cannot be standardized. Mm-hmm. With games, I mean like inventories or just the UI of using game. Like every game.
Sure. They got their own in UI language.
Which makes sense in some ways, but in other ways it doesn't. Like, why does everyone have to reinvent this every time a new game comes out? Like, this is not, some of these are not new problems. And they could fall back on, on solid UI and UX principles, but it's still, even if they are using those principles, they're still making the widget. They're still making the button. And, Syracuse talks about this with the web. It's a huge problem with the web. It's we're so used to it that we don't think about it anymore, but like every website, everyone makes their buttons, right? Everyone makes they're relying on some stuff from vendors, but you're still deciding what everything looks like. Unlike in, if you're using native code, like, yes, you can do that, but you are incentivized by quality of life in terms of development not to do that. Mm-hmm. Because if you just use iOS's, button behavior, tap gesture behavior, navigation, list UI, especially let's use Swift UI as an example. If you just use it, it's easier. It's just so easy to use it.
Right.
And also, when they change what it looks like, you get that for free.
Right.
That's always been one of the hugest benefits of being a native developer. It's just like, you get all this new stuff for free, right? And it's been thought out by people. It's been for a long time.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of, and it's not always the best. It's not always great decisions. See also the proxy icon in Big Sur. But still, it's the same. And you go back to the 1984 human interface guidelines. Like, what are we about here? We're about making sure that applications are consistent enough that users can carry over their knowledge. Doesn't matter what application they're using. They'll have some inkling of how to start, right? And the fact that we don't have that necessarily with web applications or games for that matter, it drives me a little bit crazy.
I'm with you. I don't play a lot of modern video games. The last two I've played are No Man's Sky and Valheim. And both of those inventory screens are just inscrutable. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense. And I think, to your point, why is it so hard?
Why do you got to do it? Why you got to do it different every time?
Why you got to do me dirty like that?
Like, why? Well, it's like it's a problem that keeps happening. Why is there no investment in this problem?
Which is kind of weird because they have to put the time investment into creating the interface and creating the logic that powers the interface and then designing that experience. But it is always so subpar.
Well, and it's like Syracuse talks about in that review. Like, it's not like this. These are like super pedantic criticisms. Like, normal people will experience these problems, right? For them, it will be. It'll express itself as frustration, right? As a sort of maybe even an amorphous frustration, but they're still being affected by something they might even be able to point to and say, like, I don't like handling items. Like, my wife is replaying Assassin's Creed Odyssey right now.
Yeah,
and she was explaining to me like the whole the inventory again. Talking about like all these issues with how difficult it is to do something that you have to do often, right?
Yeah.
And just like, did no one think about this? And especially with an Assassin's Creed game where it's like, they make one of these every year.
Right. You should be learning new lessons every year and improving them. We were talking about computers, and I think it was her computer. It might have been her iPhone. And she just sort of said something like, for a company whose products are supposed to be easy to use, this is really difficult. And I was thinking about that. And I was thinking about when that sort of like mindset originated. That mindset originated in the 80s, right? That was the Macs are easier to use than PCs because they have this graphical user interface, because they have a spatial finder, right?
Right.
Because
you go from orange text on a black screen in a line, right, to an actual interface, a graphical interface.
Yeah. I think that Apple has been riding on that phrase and that goodwill for the better part of 40 years.
Well, I think an addendum to that is this thing we talk about a lot of like, when was it that just works became a joke? It just works.
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, was it ever true? It feels like it was at some point, and then it wasn't. Like, it was like the frog in the boiling water, right?
Yeah.
There's just a certain point, like, yeah, and I think like a positive like counterexample, or not a counterexample, but like showing this going in the opposite direction is like you're talking about like suggesting what Mac laptop people should buy has been so difficult over the past like 5 years.
Yeah,
for reasons that we don't need to go into, but you probably know what they are. And that finally with these M1 Macs, and especially the MacBook Air, it's like just buy that one.
Get that
it's
one.
a really good computer. It's like a good value. Just buy it. Like I've already done this a couple of times. I've to two of my family members are like, listen, if you need to buy an Apple computer, buy this. I'd buy one for myself if I needed it. And like how good that feels. I didn't realize how much I missed that, to be like, I don't have to put any asterisks on this.
Right.
I don't have to couch this at all. This is a good computer that doesn't cost that much money.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And I wish that I could say the same thing for the operating system. I have a lot of arguments with my friends who are more like Windows users about Mac OS. And for me, it always devolves down to like, I don't know, like I just like it. You know?
Yeah.
Like I totally understand. I see I accept all the criticisms you just, threw at the operating system. I see where it falls down. I see how like, if you're a Windows user, like using Pages is not acceptable. Like all this stuff, from the general to the esoteric. Like there are a lot of issues, but it's like, it's what I use and I think it's better. Like, and I don't see myself using anything else. Right. But I wish that I could suggest it to a new user. And I still would. I still absolutely would over anything else suggest it as the operating system to use. But I'd still feel like I have to hold their hand with some stuff.
Yeah. But I think to your point, I think, yes, I agree with that. But I think to your point earlier about like talking to a boomer about how to use a computer, right? Like that's sort of a similar sort of situation. Like a new user is not unlike an older user. And
I'll just say this. When I talk about that kind of person, I'm talking about someone who is not curious about how to find solutions, right? And I say this is the majority of people, and I'm not criticizing. It's just it's a way of being, right? Where it's like part of the reason you and I are the way we are is because when we have a problem on a computer, we just like Google it, right?
Right, we figure out how to solve it.
We just figure out how to solve it. And we have a lot of tools to do that, right? To figure out that information. There's a lot of stuff we're building on top of. But so this kind of person we're talking about does not have those tools, right?
Right.
So anyway, go on.
So I guess maybe to your point, it is the lack, not lack of imagination, but something a little bit more than the lack of curiosity. Like as a new user, like you want to figure out how to get around, right? You don't necessarily need to, like the problems you're solving are the most basic. Like how do I turn the computer off when I'm done with it, or how do I find this file that I just saved somewhere?
Right.
How do I find the application to open the file that I just saved somewhere? Like your problems are the most basic of types, right? And for new users, like they're not worried about like what happens when I get a kernel panic, right? Or what, like how do I get my audio units working for my digital workstation? Like
how do I run disk-util in the terminal to really reformat this disk?
Exactly. How do I remount an unmounted drive that I can't find in the Finder anymore? Like, yeah, I think like exactly. Right, they're not going to be seeking out those problems because they don't have those problems yet, and they may never exist for them. Yeah, I don't know. So I think maybe the cracks around things are maybe a little bit more obvious to us than they would be to anybody else.
Well, I think but I think it's also stuff like, boot up a fresh install of Big Sur, and it's like, well, it's maybe not as bad in Big Sur, but Catalina, for instance, and like all the security warnings and all the the operating system constantly nagging you, like, are you sure you want to use this application that you downloaded and you said you wanted to use?
Right.
Are you sure you want to do this? Like, hey, I'm Pages. Is it okay if I use the documents folder?
Right.
It's like, yes. Why do I have to make this decision?
Right.
Like
Apple, you built the documents folder, and Apple, you built Pages.
It's yours.
Right.
It's your house.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
It's like I get like they're trying to be fair there, but it's like they're doing the right thing for the wrong reason, right?
Right.
or maybe the wrong thing for the right reason.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And it's just like that kind of stuff where it's like it has become very user hostile in some ways.
But I mean, maybe Big Sur is an inflection point, and maybe Catalina and Big Sur is an inflection point for the Mac OS user interface paradigm in the way that OS 9 to Mac OS 10 was, right? Like we're seeing, like, and I think we've talked about this in the past, like we're seeing the OS become sort of sequestered away from the user, so that if somebody does something to the system, the computer isn't hosed in any way, right? Like the Apple is protecting the computer from everything, right? And that comes with limitations, right? That comes with like extra permission dialogues and not being able to open unidentified developer applications, or completely blocking out system extensions or kernel extensions. I think like, and that's at the expense of sort of saving the majority of Mac users from the unknown, the things they don't know.
So I feel like a lot of my frustrations with Apple's operating systems these days basically break down to like a tragedy of the commons problem, where it's like, well, somebody somewhere pooped in the well,
right?
In a well once, so now everybody has to, have lock and key grates and security around their wells. And
yeah,
it's like, I get how that's safer for everyone, but it's like, this is not a problem I have.
Well, Apple hit a home run with the iPhone, right? And the iPad. And guess what? Now they're selling more Macs, right? And they have to adapt to a world that, like,
fair.
Windows users have had to deal with for the last 30 years, like malware, viruses, all sorts of stuff that could be coming in is now sort of becoming more of a problem with the Mac.
You remember what a cell phone that always was is like, well, Macs don't have viruses. Like, it's because nobody uses them. It's not worth it to make viruses.
Right, that was never true. Like there were always viruses for Macs, but the people making those viruses, like, they didn't do anything. And there's so few of them because the Mac user install base was what, 3-5%? So yeah, now Apple has to contend with like the consequences of a larger user base. And I know that the Mac is still pretty small in relationship, but it does take up a larger portion of the like actual like PC industry than it did 20 years ago. So I think we're sort of seeing a lot of things that the Windows side have been seeing for the last 20 years. But now we have to experience it in a similar way. Remember when it was OS or XP, just those constant dialogues about security permissions and like, sure, you want to do this, you want to do this? Boom,
Windows
boom,
still has
boom.
them.
Yeah, I
it's
know.
It's not as bad, but...
Right. But
no, that's the thing. Like people have said it before. I'll say it again. Like sometimes it feels like using Vista. I agree. All of these are problems. I disagree that these are the right solutions.
I agree with that as well. Like I mean, I guess I'm trying to understand what the situation we find ourselves in is, and like Apple is making mistakes similar to the mistakes that Microsoft made, but is there I guess the question is like, is there another way that they could engineer around that? And I don't know what the answer to that is.
Well,
I mean, certainly, like, yes, like I like when you install Catalina or Big Sur, don't prompt me with 30 permission dialogues. Maybe defer that until I actually need to launch that application.
Or batch them. Say like, this is like one decision you make.
Right. Yes. Or give me the control back to just allow me to open applications from unidentified developers, because I'm going to do it.
Yeah, or make some sort of high-level decision to say, like, I'm good. Like,
right.
I'm an expert user. I don't need all this. Right.
Right.
And, if there's consequences, like, well, that's on me. Right.
I guess so. I mean, that's on the Genius Bar, right? That's on Apple's bottom line when they have to spend X thousands of extra hours in support because some portion of their users installed something stupid. And they don't want to deal with that because they don't have to do that kind of support for iOS and iPadOS.
Let me install the Gizmo theme.
On Big Sur, the Big Sur Gizmo.
Big Sur Gizmo theme.
Big Sur X Gizmo. Cross Gizmo. That'd be something.
What was this segment? It was good, but like, what was it?
I don't know. I feel like we need to
Gomel. Welcome to Gomel.
Welcome to Get Off My Lawn.
Hashtag
Josh
Gomel.
and Matt. Yeah. Let us know your Get Off My Lawn story.
Get off my lawn, Apple.
That was maybe my favorite part of the show.
Yeah, that was good. That was fun. People are going to love it.